Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited for this EEO conversation to have with me Sonja Blignaut. Sonja is one of the biggest experts I know in the exploration of complexity, and especially in how to address complexity both from a systemic perspective and, as we will see today, also from an individual perspective. Sonja, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Emanuele. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. As you know, Sonja, we are starting these explorations from the experience of Hire, the white good appliances leader that for more than 36 years has been trying to evolve to even anticipate the market. And we believe by implementing a number of ideas taken from complexity, even if they don't explicitly mention that. So today we are going to explore, to to focus a bit on these topics. My first question for you is about the context, and with that I mean the societal context. And COVID-19 unfortunately really remembered as how uncertain, how volatile, how unpredictable our world is. And all of this was true also before that, to be sincere. But I think now everybody, also people not working in complexity, can see the huge implications into that. And I would say also the huge implications on organizations and people working in organizations, because together with safety and health problems, so we have employment problems, so we have disengagement, we have disruption in our daily professional lives. If you have kids, you know, you have to manage them with schools that are closed or with lockdown. um, what's your experience, your personal and professional experience with all of this mess? What's the role of this complexity in the most colloquial sense in your own life and work?
Yeah, I think 2020 gave all of us a masterclass in complexity and things like non-linearity and just, I think we've always known that our lives are inherently kind of playing off in an uncertain context. But I think we've in the past we could, in a way try and deny that uncertainty and almost, live as if the world was certain. And I think that's now been seriously challenged. So I think so when all of this started, I had this moment where I felt, I've been working in this field of complexity now for almost 2 decades. Some people call complexity also the science of uncertainty. And I thought, this is the moment I've been preparing for. Now is the time. And then kind of in the midst of this, I found myself on a personal level, extremely challenged by, just it like uncertainty piled on uncertainty. It's just, it's as if all our foundations have been shaken and there's no more stable ground. And I think the other thing that I find challenging, and that many of the companies I work with and also the individuals, it feels like it's perpetual uncertainty. I'm one of those people, when I go to the gym and I have to suffer through through some pain. If I know how many I need to do, I can kind of stick with it. And I think now we can't necessarily see where the end is. And I think this is a big challenge for people. And it's challenging in different ways. But as you say, in the beginning last year, I think Anne Pendleton Julian said, those of us working in complexity, we kind of felt a bit like Chicken Little, like we were voices crying in the wilderness. And that has definitely changed. Everywhere I go, people are more interested in complexity. They're engaging us we're around things like, how do we become more complexity fit? How do we deal with this uncertainty? So I definitely think there are new questions that we need to be asking, but also potentially some answers and new ways of looking at the world that lies in this field of complexity.
Do you feel at this point, as a society and as a market, we have realized the meaning of complexity. Because what I've seen so far, especially in the business world, is that many leaders really didn't believe that this was real. They always psychologically or just operationally focus on predicting, on structuring the number of exercises that you need to do in the gym, right, before reaching your target, as if you could predict that number, if that was linear. Of course, we know it's not, but is this clear now in your experience? Has this shift happened?
I I think in some cases it has. I always say in complexity, the answer that's always right to a question is it depends. Um, but I think there are some leaders that I think the penny has dropped. I think there are some that realize that the way that they've been doing things, the old competencies almost, is no longer sufficient. It's no longer working, but they haven't really. It's a big shift to make, to kind of let go of our expectations to be able to control things, to predict things. I see many, not necessarily, senior leaders, but managers in organizations. Trying to find new ways to control. So we now have distributed workforces. I've heard stories, when we do sense maker engagements and our clients, we get stories back, monitoring software that's been installed on people's laptops to see if they're actually working. So I think there is a growing realization, and you can see it. You can, for example, in consulting spaces, the big consultancies, they're all adopting complexity language. So I think complexity is becoming there's more awareness around it. I'm not always sure that people have fully made sense of the implications. I don't think that has completely, I don't think that realization is there, but there's definitely a greater openness, and there's more of a curiosity around it. And I think there is also a greater realization that's what's worked in the past is no longer working, and they're looking for something new.
How does it look at the organizational level? So, if you had to pick a few of the implications of complexity and translate them into the strategy, into the organization design, into the behaviors, even into the values of an organization, what would those look like?
Again, it depends. I think, there are a couple of things. I think it's a couple of years ago in the Harvard Business Review, there was an article that every strategy should be an hypothesis. And this idea of holding your strategy lightly, of understanding that it really is just provisional. I like to use the metaphor of, it's like crossing a river on stepping stones. It's having a sense of direction, not necessarily a particular goal that you're aiming for. It's understanding that, this step that I'm taking now is the best step with what I know now. But as soon as I take it, the context might shift, and I may need to pivot. So this idea of having long-term plans and having fixed goals, I think that is one of the things that's really being challenged. I think other things that's being challenged is, for a long time, we focused on change by focusing to a large extent on changing individual behavior. Like we wanted to train people, we expected people to change, our value statements went up on the wall, it's all these kinds of things. But it was almost like we had schizophrenic organizations. We were telling employees to act in a certain way, but then the way we were structuring, the way we were measuring, all of those things still belonged to an old context. And I think some of the things I'm seeing here in South Africa is everybody is very proud of themselves that they've managed to, in some cases, in a matter of a month, move an entire workforce of around 20,000 people, for example, to be remote workers. But they've not gone back to the drawing board and rethought about what is work in this context. How do we measure success? How, it's like we've taken an old paradigm and just tried to force it into a new way of working. And so I think we need to completely rethink our operating models, how we structure, what we expect of people, things like roles and responsibilities. You know, in the past, they were very much fixed. They were almost like governing constraints in the complexity language. Like, how do we make roles more enabling? How do we make them fluid? So I think there's implications of this all over. Even, you know, in the change management, I get myself in trouble often because I think change management is an oxymoron. But how do we shift from this thinking around we can manage change to creating organizations and workforces that are change fit, that just see change as something that's continuously unfolding? So I think we're all still making sense of these implications as we go.
Very interesting. You said change fit. I always wondered if, from an anti-fragility perspective, you can be change thriving. So at the end, really, it's possible to build the organization to give change for granted, even disruption for granted, because sooner or later that will happen, and it is happening right now in any industry, and take advantage or build on top of that. And to me, this is really the interesting part of Ayer's story. What they did, in a nutshell, is transforming for a number of decades, basically taking inspiration from the market, uh, embracing some of the ideas of competition in the market, but also of collaboration into the market, and dramatically distributing decision-making power to individuals and to teams. This idea of the micro enterprises, they have 4,000. But that's the easy part, because fragmenting at the end, it's revolutionary but easy to do. For me, the big lesson is okay, how you can maintain coherence among 4,000 groups that could do their own thing without imposing structure hierarchically. And that's what most of our organizations instead do, with a big price to pay in terms of engagement, in terms of agility, in terms of ability of sensing and reacting to the world. So they have been able to do this. And I know you talk a lot about messy coherence. What is that? And is there a connection with what I'm seeing in Ayer? Do we need more messy coherence at this time?
Yeah, I think Dave Snowden introduced me to this idea of messy coherence for the first time. And I just, you know, it's become one of my favorite concepts to just think about. And, you know, my husband thinks I'm a bit too comfortable with mess, you know, so that's another topic. But yeah, I think it is very important in this context because, you know, I think looking at what they are doing, one of the biggest risks, I think, is to lose coherence for it to become so messy that it almost fragments. I love, you know, Alicia Guerrero talks about, you know, especially when it comes time to bring it back together again, there's a difference between a clump, you know, it's almost like a sand heap, and something that has meaning or it has coherence. And so I think we need to be able to tolerate more messiness. You know, so another way that we can think about is it's coherent heterogeneity. So it's coherent difference. And there, you know, linking to what you were saying about anti-fragility, this idea of resilience. You know, resilience depends to an extent on our level of diversity. If we don't have enough diversity, then we have very limited coherence. So resilience. So we need to, there's like a requisite diversity and a requisite coherence. So it's a balance almost between messiness and coherence. And so I've been, you know, some of the things that I've been thinking about is how do we create a container for this? Because if it's completely uncontained, then, you know, the chances of fragmentation happening, I think, is really great. And I think part of this, you know, I see that you guys talk about, you know, boundaryless organizations. And I think there are always some boundaries, you know, it's never completely boundaryless, you know, so there are a couple of things that I find, you know, what are these boundaries that almost create a containing space where this decomposition and recomposition can happen, and where we can explore different options, different explore spaces almost, without losing coherence. And I think some of the keys, and it's interesting because looking at some of the pioneers, also in pioneering new ways of organizing, the power of, some people call it purpose, other calls it intent, but having a shared sense of direction, a shared task, almost an understanding of what it is that we're here to achieve. And then having some kind of enabling constraints in place when it comes to identity. It's like something that tells us, this is what you need to understand in order to be part of, even though we are, breaking up into smaller micro enterprises. How do we still belong to one identity? I think those are some of the things that becomes really important to still make sense together. It's interesting. Coherence is such a difficult word to explain to people. We all understand what incoherent means. Like if you had too many drinks, your speech becomes incoherent. You're no longer, it doesn't make sense. But to understand what coherence means, it's a difficult concept to explain. But to my mind, we still make sense. It's hanging together in a way that's meaningful. So yeah, I definitely think messy coherence is a important concept here. But then, linking back a little bit to where we started, with this whole thing of the individual, I think it's also useful to understand that this is a process that could be extremely challenging and anxiety provoking for the people in your organization if it's not contained properly.
Let me stop you here because we are coming back to this point in a moment. You mentioned purpose, and I always had this doubt, this question. In complex adaptive systems, we talk a lot about emergence. We believe that at the end, some properties are not of the node or the micro enterprise, but are happening at the system level. But on the other side, an organization has a purpose, and it's part of that coherence that we're talking about. You build an organization to achieve some goals in the market, maybe through some products. What's the relationship between the purpose that in a sense it's a matter of attracting energy, momentum, like a magnetic field, and the freedom than the individuals and the teams have. So is purpose an enabling constraint? Is purpose at the end a way to perturb the system? And what is his impact on the freedom, on the emergence at the end of the system? What's the interplay between these two actions, let's say, these two fields of the system?
I like to think of purpose as something that provides direction. So if you think of, a system, yes, there's a lot of, it's emerging and it's evolving, as it moves. It's a dynamic system. It's continuously changing and moving, but there is also this idea of path dependence. The history of it matters. So it's evolving into a particular direction, and if you want to go through a full-scale transformation, one of the reasons why it's difficult is sometimes it involves shifting, getting onto a completely new path, which requires a lot of energy. But I think if you think of purpose, and to some extent, I think the idea has become a bit corrupted. The word has become a bit corrupted. It's gotten almost like a bit of a fluffy meaning. But I think it provides almost like an attractor mechanism. You speak about the magnet. It becomes a in some, I think it's in ecological psychology, they talk about constraints that invite. So it is a constraint to a certain extent, because if I've chosen to go in one direction, it means I'm not going in another direction. So there is a constraint involved there. If I choose a particular intent or a particular market focus, for example. But I think where it links in with freedom is it provides the why. It provides that sense of direction, that sense of we're all kind of going in one direction. Whereas the freedom comes in terms of what can I explore and potentially discover as we're all moving in that same direction, but taking different paths potentially. It doesn't prescribe the what and the how. It's more a question of, where are we going and why are we going there? And I think it's key to the sense of coherence, because if we're all kind of exploring in completely different directions, that's when you start fragmenting. If you've defined at least the direction you're going into, you can still discover unexpected things and, explore in slightly different directions, but at least overall we have the similar intent.
Great. And I have a question that I believe is really connected. Adopting an emergence lens or a complexity lens, um, is it bringing more responsibility or less responsibility in individuals? Because if we say, okay, nothing can be predicted, and everything is emerging. Yes, we have some constraints, but at the end, we may have attractors, but we don't know exactly the kind of mess that is going to come up. So what is the impact I can personally generate? And then what is the responsibility I should feel on myself, whether I'm an individual or an organization, if we cannot really anticipate even the um, unexpected consequences of what I'm doing? Is it should it give us more responsibilities or less responsibility?
Well, I think maybe the first thing is to say it's not true that everything is emerging. I think for those of you familiar with the Cynefin framework, there are still aspects to the systems that we're in that's very much ordered and predictable and complicated. I think but those areas, they especially for the parts that humans get to play in them, is becoming less and less, because things that are predictable can also be automated. So I think there'll always be aspects that are predictable. So it's not as if all of a sudden everything has become emergent and unpredictable. I'm not, it's an interesting question. I think it probably requires us to take more responsibility. And I think, it's really interesting, because it's also, what you see that many organizations are doing as well is, they're pushing more responsibility to the edges, to the front line, to the smaller entities that's kind of at the coal face. From an individual perspective, I think it's understanding for, the small teams and the individuals, as you were saying, if you're in a complex system, any action can have unintended consequences. And I think we need to take responsibility for those. And we need to, this is why, we like to talk about safe to fail. How do we, if we are experimenting in a complex system, if we are exploring in uncharted territory, how do we create some constraints and boundaries around it so that if there are unintended consequences, we can contain it? But I think from an individual perspective, I think it is calling individuals to take more responsibility. And, this is one of the challenges, because many of the large organizations, I've worked with a couple where in one of my clients, that shall remain nameless, the HR director essentially told me, I've taught my people, I don't pay them to think. They are just here to execute what I tell them. And to go from a culture like that to a culture where people are able to take responsibility and they are willing to make decisions, that's a very, very difficult shift. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does, and let me come back to this. So you touched upon this point, the individual and the system, and I believe both the individual and the system have some duties, right? And this could feel daunting, because we are telling to managers, if not leaders, that have been building their career on this illusion of being able to predict, being able to plan, being promoted when you achieve the number that you made yourself, maybe cheating the system, because that's what's happening with budgeting. We know it very well, that it's just an illusion. So at the end, this is not doing any good to the system, but this is difficult to do because your entire mindset has been built on that. And we are asking them to do one step backwards, so to leave space. But at the same time, we are also asking everybody else to do one step forward, to take more responsibility, to play a bigger role. And this could be daunting as well, because having a boss telling you what to do at the end may not be that engaging, but still it's comfortable. No, you feel in your comfort zone. It's not my responsibility. So what's this interplay between the individual and the system? Can we only act at the system level without focusing our action also on the psychological aspects, on the maturity, on the development of the individual sphere?
I don't believe that you can. I think it's definitely both and at the same time. I think so for a long time, we focused very much on the individual, like much of our change processes has been around changing individual behavior. And we had almost like a training mentality, we want to train people into a new mindset or train them into a new paradigm. I think at the moment, there's almost a shift towards, intervening on the system level. And I think we need both. So I love using analogies when I try and explain complexity to people or when I consult. And one of the ones that's really kind of lands with people is this idea that it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And what we're starting to do right now, with opening up organizations and distributing leadership and distributing decision making, it's like we've opened the gates and we're trying to chase the animals out of the zoo. But it's sometimes the zoo can be in the mind. There are established cultures in these organizations where it's very difficult to go from a place where when you don't listen to a manager, or when you do make a decision and you end up making a mistake, you get punished. To go from that to an organization where everybody's taking responsibility and the managers are taking a step back, it's a very, very different context. And so you need the environment to enable the new thinking and the new behavior that you're expecting. So, what I see a lot is, and especially in, for example, organizations going through agile transformations, for argument's sake, they would send people on training courses. They would essentially teach them jungle skills and then put them back in the zoo cage where they actually can't practice what they've just learned. So you're almost setting people up for failure. So you need the system to support, whatever it is that you're trying to do. But then I think you also need to understand that you're dealing with human beings. In many of these organizations, some of these managers, in the past, status was potentially related to how many people report to you and where you are in the hierarchy. And now we come along and we say, oh, well, we don't want the hierarchies anymore. I think that's one of the mistakes that we've made, is we've demonized the hierarchy. And hierarchy is natural in human systems. I think it's a much more interesting conversation to have. How do we make the hierarchy adaptive and fluid? And I think part of that is not linking status and remuneration to it. I think that's a part of this. But to expect our managers to just be able to suddenly be in a place where they feel incompetent because the old ways of managing no longer works, and where to their mind, removing their status, they suddenly feel out of control, and we've got no way of supporting that. I think it's very unfair, to be honest.
Uh, what's the best example of an adaptive organization you can think of? Is there any other big company um, in any space that you feel is really reading complexity well and working not just at the individual level but also at the systemic level in this regard?
Well, I think some of the kind of more famous examples, like Semco, for example, uh, W.L. Gore, some of these, I think what I'm struggling to find, and then also, I'm not aware of everything that's going on in all parts of the world, but what I'm seeing in my context are large traditional organizations seeking to become more fluid, seeking to become adaptive. And I'm struggling to find examples of that. I think many of the examples that's out there are companies that, either, it's an interesting thing when you look at, for example, Morningstar, Al Gore, all of these companies, many of them, they almost started out like that. If you read, Ricardo Semler's book on Semco, none of them tried to copy the end state of somebody else's emergent journey. They kind of found their own way to become more adaptive to, these practices, and the models to a large extent emerged. And so what I'm not really seeing is in my own context in particular, I'm not really seeing many companies who are able to make the shift from a very big hierarchical traditional organization to becoming truly adaptive and responsive. Many are trying, but in the end, what I'm seeing a lot of is they almost create these little adaptive pockets next to the bigger organization. Instead of transforming, the actual system. So I can't really point to a particular example, but I'm sure that they're out there. I'm definitely sure that they're out there. You might have a couple of examples.
Why is that? What's the root cause of that?
I don't think there's a single root cause. I think there are multiple. I think for some, the old models are still working. They're still effective. They're still making money. So I think for some, the pressure is not quite there yet. I think for others, they know that they have to, but they don't know how. And you can see, like if you look to some extent, like at the agile movement, which I think to an extent, it was like a little bit of a pioneering movement in terms of starting to think differently. Many of the large organizations, they decide, oh, we need to go agile. It's like it's the thing that we need to do, but they don't really understand what it actually means. And then they start cycling through the recipes, cycling through the methods. And in the end, many of I see many failed agile implementations around me, and many of them just revert back to project offices. Or they, put in place scaling processes that's not really agile. So they go back to the familiar, and I think we underestimate sometimes the inertia that's in these organizations because of past success, path dependence. And then I think the very human aspects of this, I think if you're an executive or a manager in a large organization, you are an executive because you were the best competitor in a way in an old paradigm. And to now expect that person to suddenly shift from, I'm the one who knows, I can make decisions, I'm this, we have very unrealistic expectations of our leaders, I think. They need to be visionary and inspiring and decisive, and they need to have the answers. To expect that person to suddenly say, I don't really know. We're going to go on this path where we're going to break in, our organization into smaller pieces, and we don't know where we're going. It's emerging. It's a big leap. And these big organizations are still very, very hierarchical, very top down. So you see pockets. I think they're areas where some of this is working and emerging, but on a system level, I'm not seeing a lot of it.
But this sounds a bit like a paradox, right? We are saying organizations are emergent things, but at the end, hierarchy keeps constraining them so much that not much is emerging, and we are still perpetuating the same behaviors, the same dynamics. What's your approach? So if you had to meet this new client, a big organization, let's say a dinosaur, that still wants to become a bit more, adaptive, not only agile, because it really, what you say, it really resonates with me. At the end, it's easy to work at the team level, at the project level, to Scrum or to Kanban, but still changing the DNA of the organization, a huge organization with hundreds of years of success, is a different story. So what's your approach? From where would you start, and where would you focus in trying to make this pervasive and to increase the probability of having impact in the organization?
I don't know if I have, a particular answer to that. I think from a complexity perspective, if we had to practice what we preach, I think we'd need to try multiple different things in different spaces. But I think a key thing here would be you need to work both top down and bottom up. So you need to be intervening in different places and different levels in the organization. One of the things that we've learned is, if I want to understand an organization, if I'm able to tap into the narratives and to map what Dave Snowden calls the dispositional state, like what are the perspectives, how is this system currently disposed? Like, what are the belief systems in place? Where are the attractor wells? What is actually the current, we like to talk about a fitness landscape, almost like a dispositional landscape of a system. If we're able to map that so that we can start visualizing where is the system currently, then one of the best ways that I've seen is finding what we call adjacent possibilities, like adjacent possibles. Where are there already, for example, pockets in the system where people are thinking differently that we might be able to amplify? Where are there, for example, adjacent possibilities in the marketplace where we can start just widening a little bit their idea of who they are and their identity? What is the current disposition, for example, of the leadership? One of the things that we're doing now is mapping what we're calling the leadership field in an organization. So how is the organization making meaning of leadership? And what does that mean then for the current leaders in the organization? And then I think one of the key things from my perspective is, how do we start looking at this organization not like a static, almost like the machine, the mechanistic metaphor, but as a flow system? Because complex systems are flow systems. Humans are flow systems. If we can start thinking about what is it that flows through the system, and we're already doing some of that with things like value stream mapping, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there are some flows that we are neglecting. So things like, how does power and authority flow through the system? How does energy flow? If we start thinking about it like that, and we start looking at the constraints in place, we can start tweaking constraints to an extent to increase flow. I love the work of Adrian Bejan. I don't know if you've come across his, but he talks about, given freedom, flow systems will generate better configurations in order for things to flow more easily. So I think there's I don't necessarily have a three-step, how do you do it? But I think shifting focus so that you start looking at these systems as flow systems. Because if you think about it, a hierarchy enables flow, but it's basically a one-directional flow. If you can start applying a lens where the people in the system can start seeing, but we actually need to enable different flows. It's not attacking and demonizing the hierarchy. It's essentially focusing on things that matter to people. So how do resources flow? How does value flow? And therefore, what needs to happen to the constraints? And I think over time, you can almost create an evolutionary approach where you're going from one adjacent possible to another, and you're intervening on the level of constraints, not telling people everything that they've been doing is wrong.
It really resonates with me. On the other side, I'm wondering if you're too respectful of leaders, because at this point, many examples, even Alacracy, ask the big boss to resign power and to sign a constitution. And in many of the examples that we have been talking about, such as Semco or even Fabi, or even Ayer, at the end, some crazy leader, one morning, maybe through a long process, something submerging, as Nora Bateson could say, but one morning just woke up and said, okay, I want to open up. I want to leave space, to hold the space for other people. So there is a bit of paradox in the sense that the king is basically saying, okay, I want to leave space to democracy. Um, and in many organizations, this kind of alignment in the leaders is not there. At least this is what I see. So how to help those people that have more interest in perpetuating the status quo, in fighting their fears, giving up control, and leaving the space for that flow, multi-directional flow to happen.
I guess that's why we have coaches. But I think
But we are back at the individual
yes,
level then.
but I think the thing is, you also need to be pragmatic in this. Like, how do you can't just overnight get rid of all of these leaders. They are there. It's kind of, we need to, in a way, also deal with the system as it is. So how do and this is I don't necessarily have answers for this. These are questions that we are currently exploring, because in many organizations, people, sometimes it's actually the CEO, it's the guy right at the top that sees that things need to change, but he can't get past the shareholders, or he can't get past his executive team, and it gets blocked. Sometimes it's people in lower levels who want to initiate change, but then they hit the blocker of the guy upstairs. And there are just some realities. Some of these people are narcissists. It's so I don't know that there's an answer, but I do think there's increased pressure to change. And I think we are, because of the external context, I think we are heading to a place where if you don't change, like I was working with an executive team of one of the insurance companies in South Africa. And this team said to me, insurance has worked like this for 100 years. It'll work like this for 100 more. And that's like, okay, enjoy your Kodak moment. That's because that's where you're heading. You spoke about dinosaurs as well, but I think there's the context at some stage, I think, will force some of these changes. Personally, I don't look forward to that. So in South Africa, for example, these dinosaur companies, we're in a country with double-digit unemployment. These companies employ hundreds of thousands of people. So it feels to me we have to find ways of working with leaders as well as followers. I'm very interested, for example, in the work of Mary Ulbeen, and that shifting. I think one of the key shifts we need to make is thinking about leadership being seated in individuals, and starting to look at that leadership followership kind of dynamic almost as processes that unfold in organizations. But I think with where we are now, we have to find ways of dealing with the people who are currently in these organizations. And that means also, the guys at the top. And if you're familiar with Robert Keegan's work in terms of immunities to change and all of, these are the things that we're dealing with. And I'm not sure that anybody has a particular answer for, just creating an overnight paradigm shift in how somebody's thinking.
But again, we are going back to the deliberatively developmental organization. So at the end, at maintaining the systemic level, but really helping the individual, not just to reach his or her goals, financial goals, but the developmental goals. And I'm just wondering if all these power distribution, this idea of embracing other inputs is really coming also to the strategy level, because strategy has been, let's say, the most precious part of the thinking, but also the part that is closer to a small room of big guys calling the shots and all of that. And one thing that IR is doing on top of distributing the rational power is also distributing strategic power, meaning that what they're doing is deciding upfront that they're betting on a few industries, as they call it, platforms. But at the end, micro enterprises and the groups of micro enterprises, the enterprise micro communities, can decide if they want to bet on that platform or not. And they have advantages in doing that, but they can also pick another route. So in a sense, It's not strategy imposed or designed from the top. It's investment put on the table to attract micro enterprises to do whatever they want to do. And this is an organization with 80,000 people. Have you seen anything like that? So even the most important and most executives would say critical part of decision making open up to 80,000 people or larger groups anyway.
I think that's where we have to go, you know, and I think what I'm definitely not saying is that all of this hinges on the individual. I think, you know, the system, we have to intervene on a system level. We have to create different attractor mechanisms, different constraints, different configurations. You know, it's I think many of, you know, it's almost similar to this whole, you know, conversations, for example, about inequality and racism and things like that. You know, it's a systemic issue. I think what I'm saying is we can't completely ignore the individuals within that system. You know, it's kind of a both and. But I think what's really clever about what you just described, you know, is you are essentially shifting the dynamics around strategy and power by introducing a different form of attractor mechanism in a way. So you know, this is one of the things that I think we don't fully understand. You know, sometimes when there is a particular attractor at play, we try and attack that, you know, we try and suck the energy out of it directly. But sometimes what you need to do is create an adjacent attractor. So kind of feed something else and drain the energy away. So I think it's definitely something that I'm trying myself, you know, and in all of the conversations I'm in at the moment as well, is to kind of get out of this almost like dichotomy thinking where it's either this or that, you know, it's, you know, and how do we embrace the and? How do we embrace, yeah, it's about the humans that's suddenly being exposed to much greater levels of uncertainty. And therefore, you know, there's for many of them, there's quite a lot of anxiety. I mean, in almost every magazine article and things that we're reading at the moment, there's all of these things around increased burnout, you know, and all of this stuff. So that is a reality. But then we also have hugely problematic systems. And there's a need to think completely differently about how we organize, how we structure our business models, how we think about strategy. You know, if I just think, you know, I wouldn't want to be in the position that many of these, you know, chief executive officers at the moment of these large organizations, the decisions they need to make in this uncertainty. You know, you need the wisdom of your 80,000 people to be able to think about what's next. A single individual or a single team, there's no way that they can do it in this complexity. So I think the impetus for this change to a large extent, I think, will come from the external environment, but we need to be in a position where we're ready to embrace that and to think differently. And maybe one of the biggest issues that I see at the moment, and I mentioned it earlier, is this tendency we have to want to copy what other people are doing. We don't want to find our own fit for context way of being adaptive, of being more fluid, of, you know, we want to, you know, when somebody asks me where else has this worked, you know, it's kind of, you know, it's one of my most frustrating questions. Because something that's worked in another place will not necessarily work here. So yeah, I think we need to become more like chefs. You know, it's just one of the first metaphors Dave introduced me to as well, more like chefs and less like recipe book users. And you keep seeing, you know, like in Agile recently, this whole Spotify, you know, everybody, we want to copy what others are doing. We don't want to find our own kind of emergent messy coherence, you know, like kind of find our way forwards ourselves.
This resonates a lot with me. I believe that one of the big transitions that we are living is the organizations taking responsibility for their design. And this is incredibly complex and something they are not equipped, they are not even convinced to have the responsibility of doing it. But right now, we are in this Cambrian explosion of possibilities, and they definitely must take this responsibility on. But to me, and this is my last question to you, is this responsibility only at the organizational level? Or at the end, do the organizations are living in an inflection point at societal level. So as businesses, we have a responsibility not just for our shareholders or our budget, but also for the world, for people that are not even our customers, for citizens, for other countries, for minorities. What's the role of business? Again, from a complexity lens, in terms of boundaries, sorry, in the world. Is this only making good business, or is it giving a positive contribute to our life as a species?
No, I think it's definitely the latter. I think the time of, just being in business for making profit is over. I think it's Steve Denning that calls, this whole focus on shareholder value, the worst idea ever invented. And I think, so business, I think, has a key role to play. I think in some places, their businesses are more, they've got more influence than governments in some cases. I think people have, to a large extent, kind of lost their trust in government, in institutions, in business in some cases as well. But I think business has a key role to play, especially while we're still kind of in this capitalist system. But then I think it's not only business. I think it's also time for us as consumers to start thinking about our responsibility, because it's one thing to point a finger at companies and say, you are not acting in the best interest of the planet. But then who are the ones that's still buying the cars and buying the clothes? And, it's so I think I think it's a inflection point for humanity, not just for, business and government. It's calling all of us to take responsibility for how we're living and how we're buying, and then organizations, how we're doing business. And I really like, in some of the documents that you sent me as well, taking this ecosystem perspective, because none of these systems are closed systems. They're open systems. We're interconnected in ways that we can't really understand. So I really, this idea of crossing these boundaries, of spanning them, there's this notion of a boundary spanner, of, I've been fascinated, for example, by this whole idea of mycelia in forests and how everything is connected in ways. And I think that is a way of thinking that we need to start adopting, not only internally in our organizations, but between organizations, between different systems, organizations and governments and the citizens. It's a completely different way of thinking than what we're used to.
Thank you so much. I think we are at the end of this conversation, and I think we went through quite a long journey of exploring how complexity is or should transform the way we think as individual, as organizations, but also and hopefully as a society. And again, thank you so much for your thoughts and all the pointers to another long list of people that are contributing to this space. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, Sonja.
Thanks, Emanuele.
So how does all of this resonate with higher? Let's stop for a second and reflect on some of the concepts and ideas brought by Sonja. The insights that we heard about in our exchange show several connections with how higher is being able to interpret and especially apply complexity to its unique journey of organizational evolution. So let me stress a few points. The first one is complexity itself is the strongest common denominator between Sonja's experience and higher experience. As the Renani model can be considered among the most mature and effective implementations at scale of the dynamics between many interdependent actors producing emerging nonlinear outcomes. And it's this very nature to produce not just above the average business results, but also the superior adaptiveness most market leaders still lack, and that instead we can find in higher. The second point is that in line with complexity, the vision of an inherently customer-centric, agile, platform-based organization for the IoT era, as Ayer is, together with the aspiration of achieving high levels of quality and outcomes, is a set of enabling constraints that we find in Ayer and that we have been discussing with Sonja. In other words, instead of imposing operational rules, the white good appliances leader has inspired, energized, given common direction to ample levels of freedom granted to each microenterprise to pursue its own strategy and goals, subfields, investments, and the same charisma of the chairman Zhang Guimin operated as the attractive mechanisms. This is how Sonja called them, the magnetic force aligning diversity and engagement into a loose but very effective, messy coherence. Um, an identity, a sense of belonging there is travailing national boundaries. Think about the acquisitions of Candy or G appliances. Third point is that IRE is a perfect demonstration of how not only to acknowledge the impossibility of forecasting outcomes, but even more of the ability to turn intrinsic properties of global markets into strategic levers of motivation, of competition, and success. Instead of cascading down responsibilities, goals, and targets, the RNA intentionally distributes power and decisions to the very edge of the firm, since this is also where fresh information, ingenuity, passion solutions are generated at the contact with the customer. Another key point to the thousands of firms now looking higher for inspiration is that path dependency should serve as a reminder and warning of the deep cultural, philosophical, and historical roots that uniquely converged into the shape its organizational model as today. It is simply not possible to copy and paste it in context far removed from the one within which it evolved. This is the reason for which organizations have a humongous responsibility now of embarking on a personal journey of reflection, of exploration, of evolution. And the 36 years of lessons at putting entrepreneurship, resilience, resonance with the market front and center of IRE can indeed accelerate the trajectory of many players, but cannot solve the lack of maturity, courage, commitment, regional and sector specific enablers still required for the success of other firms. All in all, complexity and IRE teach us how looking for a full paradigm shift during night is simply unrealistic. Still, there is a way, and the way, the most sustainable and effective journey starts from the dispositional state of each organization, goes through a never ending list of adjacent possibilities, and acts on the structural and non structural constraints that unlock a continuous flow of experimentation, learning, and value generation for all the players of the company ecosystem. Now we want to hear from you. So, has your unique evolution journey started yet? Tell us more about it and tell us how all of this resonates with what we are learning from Ayer. We're going to see you in the next episodes of the EEO Conversations.